In the session today, we're going to be looking at some of the dynamics of dispossession, labour, and capital accumulation, particularly as they play out under the conditions of global capitalism. We could argue that one of the key changes to take place within the capitalist system in recent decades has been the dynamic of globalization, the globalization of capitalist productive processes and relations. The sociologist William I. Robinson has talked about the rise of what he calls transnational capital in the context of a globalized system of finance and production, and that all nations have now been integrated into this system of transnational capital. So what does transnational capital involve? Robinson says that one of the things it involves is a globalization of production. So rather than production happening, say, in one factory or in one city, as we've talked about in earlier lectures, now what we see is the fragmentation of the production process, that different segments of production have been dispersed geographically across the globe, and they've been integrated into now global distribution chains. And so the entire process of production and distribution has become globalized, that the idea that one product would be produced and distributed in the one place, which was something more common in an earlier era of ISI or import substitution industrialization, that has now become less common. We've seen, Robinson argues, a global integration of national finance and money capital or secondary derivative markets. So on the whole, what we've seen is a greater transnationalization of capital ownership. And along with that, what we've noticed is that there's been a much greater concentration of wealth. And so in an earlier scenario where you might have had a very large number of corporations, both corporations in Western capitalist nations as well as corporations local to, say, India or Vietnam or a variety of other countries who had their own industries, who nationally promoted their own industries, what we see in this moment of the rise of transnational capital is that now wealth is concentrated in fewer and fewer corporations, and it's predominantly those owned and controlled in the global north who exercise dominion over these transnational corporations, even though that's not exclusively the case. And as we'll see later in this lecture, there are also cases of these transnational corporations headquartered in and controlled by transnational capitalist elites in the global south as well. The division of labor, Robinson argues, has also become global, and so now what we're seeing is the onset of transnational labor migration as people again migrate predominantly from the global south to the global north, but also within global south countries, also from, say, poorer global south countries to newly industrializing countries, that there is a much bigger market, a global market for migrant labor, and that rather than people predominantly being employed in factories in their own countries, what we're seeing is that wealthier capitalist nations are drawing on the labor force of people from poorer countries who often experience out-migration and then receive those families receive remittances. And Robinson says that in the 2000s, wage remittances from the sending of money from richer countries to poorer countries quadrupled in the 2000s. That it was by 2011 it was more than $500 billion. So how was the global market in labor originally created? Marx argues that the world market in labor was created through slavery, through indigenous dispossession, stealing the land from indigenous people, taking over and controlling that land, possessing it, through European migration, and then in the aftermath of slavery through coolie labor, through people being brought as indentured servants, again from countries like China and India in the global south to work in the New World. So Marx comes up with the concept of primitive accumulation to describe this. And what he says is that people in this sort of prehistory of capitalism were violently dispossessed from their lands, from their livelihoods. So the peasants that he talks about were forced to leave their lands, and they were forced into wage labor. This dynamic for Marx, this dispossession of people from their lands, is what leads to the first kind of creation of a global market in labor, because people are no longer able to be independent. They're not able to support themselves on their land, to grow their own produce, even if, under a feudal system, they still had to give some of that to the feudal lords. But nevertheless, they had some degree of independence when they worked on their own lands and produced their own food. But Marx argues that under a moment of primitive accumulation, they're forced into wage labor. And this is how, for Marx, we get the development of the global proletariat, is because people have no other means or resources other than their own wage labor to sell. Now, for Marx, what he calls primitive accumulation belongs to the prehistory of capitalism. This is not a dynamic of currently existing capitalist society. For Marx, or even the 18th century capitalism that Marx was looking at, 18th, 19th century, this is, for Marx, primitive accumulation belongs to a stage prior to capitalism. Now, David Harvey has disputed this idea that dispossession and accumulation belongs to this earlier period of capitalism, and he says, well, we need to understand how capitalism is based on the ongoing violent extraction of resources and of land, and he argues that that has only intensified under neoliberalism. So Harvey, instead of using the term primitive accumulation, which is what Marx calls it, Harvey uses the phrase accumulation by dispossession in order to describe what he sees as an ongoing process. And he says that, in fact, the struggles over those resisting dispossession have become key sites of struggle among social movements today. Now, there is actually another take on this question of dispossession that comes from the theorists Jody A. Bird, Alyosha Goldstein, Jody Malamed, and Chandan Reddy. And they talk about, in their article, Predatory Value, they talk about what they call economies of dispossession. And this is an attempt to engage with the theories of accumulation as put forth by Marx and put forth by David Harvey, but rather a perspective that comes from Black radical traditions, from critical ethnic studies, and from indigenous critical theory. And in their article, they define economies of dispossession as, quote, multiple and intertwined genealogies of racialized property, subjection, and expropriation through which capitalism and colonialism take shape historically and change over time, end of quote. So how does the idea of economies of dispossession differ from Marx's and Harvey's approach? So this concept critiques that analytical separation between the idea that we could have original accumulation, such as colonization or dispossession, and that later under neoliberalism we have accumulation by dispossession. So that even though Harvey is criticizing Marx's staged approach, he still retains this distinction that colonization, that slavery, that these practices belong in a sort of prior moment to the neoliberal era, and that what we have happening now is something somewhat distinct from earlier colonization. For the authors of Predatory Value, they underscore the ongoing role of colonization and racialization in the operation of capitalism. So they see colonization not as something that existed in the past, but a continuing relation of theft, a continuing relation of displacement. They argue that Indigenous dispossession continues to provide ordering logics of power and accumulation for those who live on Indigenous lands. So again, rather than seeing Indigenous dispossession as something that happened at a moment of colonial encounter when the United States was invaded, when Australia was invaded by colonial occupying forces, that's not simply something that happened in a past era and then ended. It's something that continues to exist, and that those logics of possession and dispossession continue to shape how all of us who live on Indigenous lands experience those ordering logics of power. And then the authors also see these primary conditions of possibility existing in all of these various aspects: colonization, indigeneity, racialization, chattel slavery, and also the heteropatriarchal household economy. So the global labor market is something that was not just created in a moment of primitive accumulation, but is something that is shaped by ongoing processes of dispossession in a situation where colonialism and colonial logics of possession and dispossession continue to throw people off their land, to dispossess them. So how do those processes feed into what Robinson talks about as global labor supply chains? Robinson argues that in the structural crisis of the 1970s, as we looked at when we talked about neoliberalism, capital attempted to break the constraints that trade unions, working classes, popular classes in a range of national contexts, from the United States to Chile to Indonesia, had put on accumulation. So these growing, rising demands by vibrant trade unions, by communist movements, had really been pushing to demand a greater share of national wealth. So what happened was, when capital broke those constraints, as we talked about, through violence, through coercion, and implemented free trade and neoliberal policies, what these policies did was that they displaced millions of people. And in doing so, by impoverishing people, by throwing them off the basic supports that they had, by getting rid of their jobs and moving those jobs overseas and leaving them unemployed, by pushing them off their agricultural lands as capitalism took over capitalist corporations took over the production of agriculture in rural areas. All of these processes led to the displacement and dispossession of millions of people and generated a vast pool of disposable labor for the global market. So Robinson argues that this has led to the basis as a maintenance of pools of flexible, super controlled, and super exploited immigrant labor. And one of the ways in which this super exploitation of these disposable labor is achieved is by dividing the working class into immigrants and citizens. And so that vast pool of disposable labor are people who are often forced to migrate from the global south, within the global south, and also from the global south to the global north. And when they come to the global north, where they're often in situations where they have precarious work situations, precarious visa situations, where they're often undocumented, that is what's used against them to make their situation even more precarious. And Robinson argues that the immigrant labor force in these countries becomes responsible for their own maintenance and reproduction, because they're often forced to live large numbers of people to in cramped accommodation where they're not paid enough to look after themselves. A lot of the money that they send is sent home through remittances, and thereby making them also responsible for their family members abroad. So often a few members of the family migrate to other countries to look for work, and then their family back home, who themselves have been dispossessed, have been displaced, who have no means to support themselves, are forced to live off those remittances. So the 1970s presented one structural crisis. We also see another structural crisis in 2008 with the collapse of the global financial system and the system being no longer able to continue to function in the way that it was structured. We could argue that 2020, with the impact of the COVID-19 virus and the subsequent economic catastrophe with massive rises in unemployment, also presents the most recent structural crisis. What are some of the contours of this crisis? Well, on the one hand, the system is reaching its ecological limits with the overuse of fossil fuels, with the continued degradation of the environment by capitalism. What we've seen is a huge increase in extreme weather events, such as hurricanes, such as forest fires, as heat waves. And this is only increasing, and we could even possibly argue that COVID-19 is one more expression of this as human beings degrade the environment further, come closer into contact with the natural environment, that the likelihood of this kind of infectious disease spread will only increase. We currently see a crisis of mass incarceration and racist policing against Black and Indigenous populations. There is a concentration of global communications in fewer and fewer hands, which means that the kind of information that we get is much more heavily controlled by often conservative political voices and politicians and even corporations. There's been a greater commodification of everything under neoliberalism, and as Robinson argues, capitalism is reaching the limits to accumulation. As we looked at a few weeks ago, we are at a point where everything is up to being commodified, whether it's leisure, whether it's love, whether it's family, whether it's dating, whatever it is. All aspects of our life are readily amenable to commodification. And then what we've seen is a rise of a planet of slums as people are forced into the peripheries of cities, poor people forced to live on those peripheries of cities in situations of insecure housing, insecure healthcare, insecure services and infrastructure. And on a massive level, they are denied these most basic sort of aspects of public welfare. The impact of COVID-19, we could say, has been to, in some senses, lay bare these fractures, that we've really seen how vulnerable the health systems are, and how much, with the retraction of publicly funded health systems, publicly funded unemployment benefits, all of the things that sort of hold a society together in crisis, the absence of those have really shown us, particularly in societies like the United States, that all of these fractures of the structural crisis that faces us. So what are some of the responses? So Robinson says, well, one of the responses to the structural crisis is 21st century fascism, is to sort of, for the right wing to sort of double down and move on full scale, full speed ahead with its free market agenda, pushing through all kinds of sort of relaxing of ecological regulations, increasing the policing and bringing in the feds against protesters. All of this we've seen recently, particularly under the presidency of right-wing people such as Donald Trump in the United States or Narendra Modi in India. among many others. Another response, he says, is global uprisings, and this is also something that we have seen from Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the number of radical movements coming out of traditions, left-wing traditions, black radical traditions, to protest against this situation and to critique this structural crisis. So one example of contemporary resistance that brings together a lot of these elements, from transnational capital to resource extraction and the environment, to colonial logics. One of the current examples that brings these together is the Adani coal mine in Queensland. So Adani Enterprises is a very powerful Indian mining corporation, and in 2010 they proposed to build Australia's largest coal mine. They said that this coal mine would produce up to 60 million tonnes of coal from the proposed Carmichael mine in Queensland, and this coal would be shipped through the Great Barrier Reef, and it would eventually be shipped back to India to feed Indian power stations. This would be the second largest expansion of coal on the planet. Now, the mine was to be built on the traditional lands of the Wangan and Jagalingou peoples in the Galilee Basin in Queensland. At the same time, the far-right government of Narendra Modi in India has also given permission for this corporation, Adani Enterprises, to build open-cast coal mines in India's Hasteo Aran forest, which is home to the Adivasi Gond peoples. If it goes ahead, these coal mines will destroy about 80% of the forest and destroy some 30 villages. So what we've seen in result to this proposal of the mine by Adani is the emergence of broad-based international movements that have emerged to protest the coal mines, and these protests are being led by Indigenous peoples in both Australia and India. So in the top right-hand corner, we can see Adrian Burragaba from the Wangan and Jagalingou peoples, and he and the W&J peoples have challenged the Adani company both in the local courts, in the state and national courts through native title legislation and also through local Queensland cultural heritage legislation. They've gone to the United Nations to appeal to international legislation, and they've also engaged in protests, occupations. They've built a corroboree grounds on the land where the coal mine is to be built. At the same time, the Gond people in the Hasteo forest have also been engaging in protests. They've set up a tent in Fatehpur as a centre for their protests. They've submitted letters to state government authorities. And the efforts by these Indigenous people in both of these countries has led to the growth of a very large international movement that I think we can talk about as the authors of the Predatory Value article refer to as anti-colonial solidarities. So at the same time as we're confronted with a moment of structural crisis today, we're also seeing the emergence of new movements to challenge economies of dispossession, to challenge the resource extraction, the ecological destruction, and the ongoing dispossession by fascist governments and transnational elites such as Adani. As of July 2020, the Stop Adani campaign had pushed 65 companies to rule out working with the Adani mine. The mine still has no private investor, and the campaign was able to successfully veto a $1 billion handout of tax dollars to the corporation. So for 10 years, Adani has still been trying to build the Carmichael mine, and as of 2020, there is still no mine. So from this example, we can see the sort of shifts that we've been talking about from going back to Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto and his call for a proletariat revolution, how some of those ideas and how some of those struggles are alive today in the struggles against dispossession.